This is Camille Nixon with Neotechnology talking to Tim Williamson from Monsanto. Thanks so much for being with us today, Tim. Please tell us a little bit about your role in your current project.
Okay. I'm a data scientist at Monsanto. My role focuses on coming up with clever ways to help both myself and other people at the company get better inferences out of our genomic data sets.
Genomic data sets. Can you tell us a little bit about what you mean?
Sure. So our company develops seed products that are sold in 160 different countries. And we back those products with extensive R&D pipelines designed to make sure that we can make the best possible seed developed to be grown in the best possible environment. And we do that by gathering a lot of data. So we gather a lot of genomic sequence data, and we crunch a lot of data, and we use that to try to make better selections on what products should move forward. To continually improve the genetic performance of our products.
So your talk today had the title of, graphs are feeding the world. Tell me a little bit more what you mean.
Yeah, so the way that I sum up the situation is that if you look across where we're going to be between now and a couple decades from now, by 2050, there are a lot of good estimates produced by the UN that suggest that we're going to have a world population of over 9.5 billion people. And those 9.5 billion people compete for a lot of resources. So it's more people to feed, sure, but as those people expand into cities and they leave their rural lifestyles, that expanding footprint comes at the expense of arable farmland. And that growing middle class also has acquired a taste for diets that are higher in animal-based protein. And all of these things require significant intensification of agricultural production to sustain. And the one way that humanity's become really good at that is by continually developing better products. So we know that over thousands of years, we've been able to produce crops that have gone from kind of tiny, I used examples in my talk of really tiny ancestor plants that you would never think of to, 10,000 years from now, or 10,000 years from the past, modern corn that we all know. Inside of our pipeline, we do the same thing at a much larger scale. So we're continually looking at what are the best possible plant varieties out there in the world. What genetic traits do they have that make them, say, grow very well, or need less water, or need less fertilizer, or withstand really dry, arid conditions. And we cross those plants together and screen their progeny genetically to determine which ones we want to keep. And that's how we determine what goes into the next bag of seed that we sell a farmer. And every year that we do that, every product grows a little bit more and takes a little bit less to grow. And that's how we move the needle.
So all those variables sounded a little bit like a graph to me. So can you tell me about the problem that you were solving, how you landed on graphs, and how you landed on Neo4j?
Sure. So there's a lot of really cool genetic problems that have been in existence for a while that rely on you being able to treat your data set as an ancestor family tree. So our data sets are no different than the data set that you might get if you signed up for Ancestry.com and look at your family tree. Same thing, just a lot more relatives.
Well, you haven't seen my family.
That's true. I haven't seen your family tree. But hopefully you don't have millions of children.
I can't
Yeah.
comment.
So that became quickly untenable so we've been a plant breeding company for about 20 years, and we inherited data sets going back 60 years. And for a while, we dealt with that data set in a very classical Oracle relational database mindset, very, very classical for a company of our size. But the problem is that every question that we would want to ask as we try to employ more modern data analysis techniques needed lots of real-time analysis to be run, but it would take us seconds to minutes to hours to perform one round of analysis, and that doesn't scale. So we're fond of saying that you can develop the coolest algorithm in the world, but if you can't run it over the scale of an entire pipeline, it doesn't move the needle at all. It doesn't move the needle for us. And so we settled upon a graph. We kind of discovered that our data set naturally matches a graph, and it was really easy to model into a graph, and therefore really easy to write these algorithms into graph queries. And once we did, we were able to do two things. One, analysis that used to take minutes to hours took seconds, which was really cool because then we could do it across everything. So I could ask the same question of several million objects instead of one at a time, and that freed us up to make some really cool abstractions around important genetic features. So, for example, what are our most popular ancestors? So what ancestors continually form the crosses that are most productive? Well, that tells us something about which plant varieties are the most productive, and that means we want to spend more time researching those and less time researching the duds.
And so you were recognized that it was a graph, and then how did you find Neo4j?
So we started. We found Neo4j initially by simple mailing list and Google searches, and we ended up, after we kicked the tires on that, we ended up doing a more extensive evaluation of Neo4j against one other product. We tried to use Titan for a while, and essentially we settled upon Neo4j for reasons related to, one, our analysis is heavily real-time dependent. So we need to be able to serve up these queries really, really quickly, which meant the horizontal scaling across identical copies of the data and guaranteed index-free adjacency is a big deal. Second, our data set is heavily factual-based. And the example that I use for that is if you consider the classical graph problem, the social networking problem. If you wanted to split your graph across a bunch of nodes and then recommend new friends for you, you probably wouldn't notice if some of your friends were missing from the network. You would never notice it. But in our case, if we're trying to run a genetic analysis and I give two different data scientists different answers for the parents, we have a problem. And that was a guarantee that we had on Neo that we didn't have on another platform. So our consistency model was such that we needed those guarantees.
Well, that's one of my favorite features about Neo4j is the ACID compliance and the actual...
Cool.
So you're liking it. It's not even in a transactional situation, but you still find value in that.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, good, because it's hard to develop it and keep it, but we do. Okay, so you've landed on Neo4j. What kind of results has that brought you?
Well, what we ended up doing with Neo4j in this particular case is we built a platform around it, and then the truest sense of the word. So we have this wonderful Neo4j cluster with all this genetic history data. We built a really rich API over it that allows our geneticists and our app developers to speak and execute complex algorithms in really simple terms. And that has created an ecosystem at our company. So that system has been in production for about a year now, actually a year and a month. It was right before Graph Connect last year. And there are now about 120, 130 different applications and data scientists that have built stuff over it. So we act as force multipliers. So those are people that are then taking our data sets and building their own applications and their own data science routines out of it. And that group of people has made about 700 million REST requests so far. And those numbers aren't particularly staggering if we were an external-facing web company, but that's an all internal data science being done. And that's been very transformative for us.
And then is Neo4j standing alone in this project, or did you keep the legacy infrastructure and Neo4j is playing with? How did you deal with all that?
So that's a fantastic question, because I think that one of our challenges is that ultimately we're paid to keep the lights on. So I like to say that we built a really sexy, awesome data store, and we gave people access to it. But the reality is that it would not be real time if the data was stale the minute we turned it on. And we're in a situation in our company where we do have a lot of big data, like large data monoliths, with a lot of important but old applications writing to them. And we can't simply go to those development teams and say, you have 5 days to convert over to writing your data to us. That, I don't know if you've ever dealt with high-strung project managers, but that wouldn't play very well. So the way that we kind of worked...
Again, I cannot comment.
Okay, good. Well, the way that we worked around it is we let those apps live for a while. We've slowly started moving all of our new apps over to read from Neo. And then to handle the right situation, we actually built a streaming pipeline from our Oracle Exadata monolith out to Neo. And we accomplished that we used a little bit of Oracle technology. So we utilized their Golden Gate platform to broadcast a change stream. And we wrote a custom coded adapter that feeds that change stream into an Apache Kafka cluster. And we use that cluster to feed our graph. And the net effect of that is within a second or two of a write from a legacy app coming into Exadata, with no work done from that team, we reflect that update in the graph.
How have you found it to develop in Neo4j, particularly in a somewhat complicated environment?
Very well. So one thing I like to say is that, at least for our domain, because it maps so well to a graph structure, there's no impedance mismatch. So if you were to look at our code base and the algorithms that we've written, and you were to also have side by side with you like any genetics textbook that you would find in a graduate in a PhD program, all the patterns that we've coded algorithms for natively show up in those textbooks. They're known things, which means it's really easy when I can start expressing those patterns in a language that better matches how those patterns fit both my mental model and the model of those that are going to consume them. So it's like having a well-fitting library for the job.
It sounds like the project has been really successful and you've been enjoying the last 13 months or so in production. What lessons have you learned? What would you do differently if you could begin again?
Wow. I really, really wish that we hadn't had to deal with the sync problem. We spent more problems building up that streaming pipe. It was harder to build up that streaming pipeline than it was to build the graph database itself. But that was a good lesson in and of itself that you can't get around. One thing that I think that I would do I think we've learned a lot from it, is the way that we went about modeling and coding things. I think that we definitely learned right away that on our first trip to the whiteboard, we thought that we had it all figured out what was an efficient graph model. And the beautiful the beautiful yet complex things about graph modeling is that there's no right way to do it except when you've picked the wrong way. So we went through about a good month where we thought we had a good model stood up, then we would benchmark it and realize it was not performing very well, and we had to iterate over and over. I would have allowed more time for that iteration, because that was very valuable about understanding our access patterns. What else? The same thing for our traversals. I think we took a very iterative approach to developing all our algorithms as far as what we did via Cypher and what we did via the traversal framework, and I think I would do that all over again, but now I would know what I know now about how to be very methodical about doing that.
Is there anything you'd like to add, anything that people really need to understand about what you're doing or how Neo4j can work for them, anything at all?
Yeah, so I'm a scientist by training, a life scientist, and it has been fascinating to me the number of neat use cases for graph analysis and graph databases in life sciences that no one's working on. So one slide I showed in my talk at the end were some neat examples from literature mining that I've done. Going all the way back to 1921, there was this beautiful textbook illustration of someone showing a family tree of chickens, actually, where he had mapped out a graph-based algorithm for saying, if these are all my ancestors, this is how each one contributed to me genetically. And that was cool because in the 1920s, we had no idea what modern molecular biology was. And more importantly, there was no graph database. But he was describing this algorithm that it actually turns out works really well. And we're trying to port that over our Neo4j instance right now. That's really cool, I think. And I think that more people, I would like to see more developers with this skill set get really excited about working in a problem space that they might have considered off limits to them. But the reality is it's not at all. The barrier to entry is very low.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. Really appreciate your time, and thanks again for doing the talk today as well. This is Camille Nixon with Neo Technology signing off with Tim Williamson from Monsanto.